everyone, and welcome to tonight's evening conversation with Senator Ben Sasse and philosopher James Smith on the vanishing American adult, our coming-of-age crisis, and how to rebuild a culture of self-reliance. As you can tell, we're quite full tonight. I was going to point out any empty seats. If there are people still standing in the back, there's a few right over there, as well as some being taken up there, so no need to stand. There are still a few left and available. We're really delighted that each of you could come here tonight. I'd like to, at just the very beginning, thank one of our sponsors, one of our trustees, Byron Smith, and the Creed and Culture Fund, who made this evening possible. We are deeply grateful, Byron, and thrilled that you could be here, as well as to recognize a few special guests this evening. We're pleased that the chairman of our board, Price Harding, is here, along with another trustee, Richard Miles, Congressman Jim Cooper from the great state of Tennessee, as well as, I understand, a Nashville delegation. So welcome, gentlemen. We're delighted that each of you are here on this hot and steamy night. I'm looking around. I see a number of faces who are here for the first time, and we want to particularly welcome you. And we've been really overwhelmed by the enthusiasm for this event. We sold out with just a few days, and we know that you probably have many friends who could not make it tonight. So if you have friends who are still languishing on the waiting list, fear not. You can actually text them right now and let them know that they can actually follow along on a live stream at www.ttf.org/events. We'll also have video posted within the next couple days, as well as photos up on Facebook, and be live tweeting as well, all ways to follow along, even if your friends are not in this room. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature that explore enduring questions, as well as connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as the one tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in order to better engage life's greatest questions and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. With each new conversation, we try to take on and wrestle with one of those great questions. And in many ways, the great questions of life can be distilled down into a couple of biggies. What does it mean to be a good person? And what is a good life? And there are few activities in life that more directly or dramatically force one to grapple with those questions than attempting to raise children, or so I am told. All parents function, consciously or not, as practical philosophers as they seek to form the character and the priorities of the young people in their charge. Parental assumptions and convictions about the nature of the good life and the components of an admirable character play out in practical and concrete ways as they instruct a child how to act, what to prioritize, whom to emulate, and who and what to love. And perhaps the most potent form of instruction is example, such that whether or not we have children, what we ourselves do on a regular basis shows, rather than simply tells, what we love and what we value, and therefore, what we are becoming more and more like. Our keynote speaker tonight has started a conversation and caused a stir with the observation that something is amiss even among the most gifted and privileged of young people now. In his words, there has been a decline of agency, of initiative, and of liveliness, and increased passivity in youth culture, and the rituals and practices that have historically matured, empowered, equipped, and formed adolescents into resilient, self-reliant, problem-solving souls who see themselves as called to love and serve their neighbors. Those rituals are now in decline, either crowded out by screen time or pushed away by snowplow parents who attempt, to thoroughly mutilate a metaphor, to shield their special snowflakes from obstacles, challenges, and even hard work. And he warns that a deferment of adulthood has profoundly destructive consequences, not only for individuals, but also for our country writ large. as a healthy government requires self-government, which in turn requires thoughtful, informed, and engaged adults as citizens. Having offered a diagnosis of what ails the body politic, he also offers a prescription regimen of intergenerational socializing and relationships, an embrace of work and difficulty, reduced consumption, broad reading, frequent travel, all aimed at trying to change the imaginative conception of what the good life is and should be. It is a provocative and countercultural argument, and it's hard to imagine a thought leader, much less a senator, who could make it with more conviction, boldness, historical expertise, or panache than our speaker tonight. Senator Ben Sasse is the junior senator from Nebraska, where he was swept into office less than 2 years ago with a landslide victory of over 65% of the vote, winning every single one of Nebraska's 93 counties, which he visited in his own retrofitted Winnebago. Ben grew up in Fremont, Nebraska, a fifth-generation Nebraskan, worked summers in the soybean and corn fields before leaving to study as an undergrad at Harvard, followed by graduate work at St. John's, then at Oxford, and a completion of his PhD in history at Yale, where he received both the Field Prize for his dissertation and the George Washington Eggleston Award. Over the course of his career, he's worked at Boston Consulting Services and private equity, and is the executive director of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, as well as at one point as the editor of Modern Reformation Journal. He also worked as a staffer on Capitol Hill and at the Department of Homeland Security and HHS before assuming the presidency of Midland College in Nebraska, one of the youngest college presidents in the country, where during the next 4 years he turned a nearly bankrupt college into one with a 7-figure surplus, which was the fastest growing college in the Midwest at the time. Since coming to the Senate, Ben has quickly established a reputation as one of the Senate's most thoughtful, historically informed, and articulate members, even if he is still occasionally mistaken for a page. He also holds the distinction of being the only member of the Senate, perhaps the only member of all Congress, in being actively engaged, along with his wife Missy, in homeschooling their 3 children, Elizabeth, Alexandra, and Breck. Once Ben is done speaking, we'll hear a response from philosopher James K.A. Smith, also known as Jamie Smith. Jamie's a philosopher and a professor at Calvin College, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. He's also the award-winning author of Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Desiring the Kingdom, and the excellent work, You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. His new book, Awaiting the Kingdom, Reforming Public Theology, will soon be released in November of this year, so stay tuned for that. In addition to all of that, in his downtime, perhaps, he is a senior fellow at Cardis, serves as the editor of Comment magazine, and writes widely for such popular publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Books and Culture, and First Things. In addition to that, he and his wife, Deanna, are the parents of 4 children, and we're delighted that Deanna is joining us tonight as well. After Ben gives his keynote remarks, we'll hear from Jamie, and then after that, we'll have a moderated conversation followed by a time of audience Q&A. Senator Sasse, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And let me first just admit that Sharia is a truth teller. I am regularly mistaken for a page. And I also, we do a hybrid commute. So I think I'm one of only about, 5 senators out of 100 who's never been a politician before. And I'm fairly certain that I'm the only person who does this family commute where we bring kids with us coming and going from DC. I get home every Friday afternoon. Sometimes, depending on vote schedule, you might get home Thursday night, you might get home Saturday morning. But the first thing that happens at my house is I go to my wife and she tells me which kid annoyed her most that week. And they become my date for the next week. So being mistaken for a page is actually less interesting than when I come back into the Capitol late at night with a kid, and as I pull up and one of the Capitol Hill police officers doesn't recognize me, and I might not, if I've been out playing ball with my kid on the mall or something and I'm wearing workout clothes and I don't have a Senate pin on, and the Capitol Hill police officer will say, looking at me, where's your ID? And I'll just say, oh, Senator. And he goes, yeah, right, where is he? In the back of the SUV? Like, where is this guy? So I'm regularly confused with not being of the Senate. It is a pleasure to be with you. Cherie and I, she omitted the fact that we went to college together. I know she looks 10 years my junior. I'm learning how to be a politician. But it's a delight to be with you. And it's fun to have Price Harding here. When I was leaving Midland University, as I was elected to the Senate in 2014, we hired a search firm to replace me as president of the college. And Price ran the search and served Midland incredibly well. And Jamie, it's a privilege to have you here to respond tonight. Providentially, I just so happened to stumble across this a couple of days ago when I found out you were going to be the respondent. And when I was drafting this book, the idea comes from my time at the college. I was there from 2009 until being elected in 2014. But this idea for the book comes from about 2011, 2012, but I didn't really write it until early mornings and weekends last summer and fall. And as I took drafts of the book and I would hand it off to different friends of mine to give me feedback, one of my friends literally gave me this note back. He said, it's a really good book. It would have been better if you just read Jamie Smith's book, because it's the same basic argument and much better. And so, here I have the note of my friend telling me all the ways that Jamie's book is better than mine. So thank you for the humility of getting to speak to you tonight. So if you'll tolerate this, because we have a decent chunk of time together, but it's in 3 parts. It's me sort of speaking at you, monologue for a minute. It's Jamie responding, and then Cherie facilitating a dialogue among the 3 of us, trialogue. And then we're going to do Q&A. I might try to keep this chunk a little bit shorter to make sure we have time for portions 2 and 3. So instead of giving you a linear speech, I would like to just introduce 7 distinctions. And I'm going to do this as sort of lightning round. My assumption is that most of you haven't read this book yet. And so instead of walking you through the whole book, I would like to give you a little bit of grammar that you can use that we'll have in common when we wrestle through this book. So I'll first do the speed round, and then I'll unpack it a little more slowly. First, I'd like to distinguish between adolescence and perpetual adolescence, because this book is not an old man screaming, "Get off my lawn." So fundamentally, this is a constructive project, and I want you to know that I think adolescence is a real blessing. Adolescence is a special gift. It's a concept that's only about 2 millennia old. Perpetual adolescence is the boogeyman that I'm worried about in this book, so I'd like to draw that distinction. Second, I want to unpack a little bit the distinction between production and consumption. And a subset of that is inside consumption. It's useful to distinguish between needs and wants. I don't think we're doing a very good job right now as we raise our kids in helping them internalize distinctions that most people didn't have to have taught to them throughout most of history. This production-consumption distinction, almost everyone knew it experientially as they came of age. Third, I think we're entering the 4th stage of economic history. And that isn't just a throwaway from my mom, who thinks I wasted a whole bunch of years in graduate school. I need to do a little bit of history here, because I think you can only make sense of the particular challenge of coming of age experience for our kids and the challenges of shared parenting in a time like this if you understand the disruptions of our time and place in economic history. And there are 2 sub-pieces of that. One is the changing nature of work itself, and the second is the changing nature of neighborhoods and localism because of the changed nature of work. So I want to distinguish a little bit among those 4 periods of economic history, but especially the transition from the 3rd stage of economic history, which is roughly industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, and this new thing which we don't even know how to name yet. Fourth, I'd like to talk a little bit about the crisis of loneliness and distinguish that from a lot of other crises we face at the present moment, because we have lots of crises. We have a crisis of, I think, of civic catechesis, in that our kids don't really understand the American idea. They don't understand what American exceptionalism is. Tonight, nothing that we're going to talk about is narrowly political, and by that I mean legislatively political. It's broadly political in that it relates to the city, it relates to the common community, but it's not primarily about power, about compulsion, which is the nature of government. It's much more about the nature of community, as in the things that Jamie writes about habits and about loves and about affections and about persuasion. But you can only make sense of the crisis of civic catechesis by having some broader sense of what's happening with what I think of as this crisis of loneliness in our time. Fifth, I want to distinguish between education and schooling. School is a tool. Education is something much broader than school. School is a wonderful thing. The vast majority of schools are special gifts, but they're still narrow. They only accomplish specific things. They're means to an end. They're term limited. You graduate, you leave, you commence, you go out from them to the rest of life, which is the beginning of the stuff that follows, which tells you that school was supposed to be a means. And right now, we don't think very clearly about what schools are for, and so we tend to project on them a hope that they can solve almost all of our problems. And I'm critical of that, not because I'm critical of the schools or the teachers, but I'm critical of us for failing to distinguish means and ends, and failing to distinguish between the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the kinds of things that people would dedicate their freedom to be, right? That you want freedom from all sorts of bad things in the world so that you can go be freedom to, so you can go have freedom to become all these things, these loves, these hopes, these pursuits of the highest and best that you could invest your life and your time in. Sixth, Cherie flagged this, there's a distinction between self-restraint, self-governance, self-control, and self-reliance, as opposed to other control, or other discipline, or other restraint, or other reliance. And so, though this book is not in any way about politics, narrowly speaking, The Vanishing American Adult is 100% not about politics, and I would posit that it's 95 to 99% not about policy. It is about the Republic, because our Republic believes certain things about fully formed adult men and women, and the kinds of self-control and self-restraint they have. The world is broken. And in a broken world, there are people who want to take your life and your liberty and your stuff. And there will be order-seeking in the world. It is inevitable that people will seek security. And our experiment, this American experiment, believes certain things about the capacity and the potential of people, but that requires the internalization of certain kinds of self-governance and self-control and self-reliance so that we don't need to have other forms of external controls that come in and oppress and control from some distant place. And then seventh and finally, I'd like to use the metaphor of training wheels removal. And usually when you think about training wheels, you think about little kids. But as we wrap up my little bit of our time together, I'll want to unpack a tiny bit how to think about parenting a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old as having lots more analogy to parenting a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old than you might previously have thought. Our kids are 15, 13, and 6. Girl, big gap, providential surprise. Our son. And by the way, if anybody has seen a little boy's flip-flop anywhere around the Capitol, that would be mine. I've been looking for one all day today. We lost a shoe. So anyway, when I bring 15 or 13-year-old girl, they're pretty self-sufficient. When I bring a 6-year-old with me for a week, I need a lot of help from a mother-in-law. And happily, my in-laws retired at the Pentagon. And so I've got a mother-in-law only about a half an hour away. So when my 6-year-old is here with me, I rely on a network. I rely on helps. But it's interesting to have a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old at the same time as you have a 6-year-old. Because when you have kids, when you're pregnant for the first time, or when you have a 6-month-old or a 12-month-old and you're exhausted and you're sleep deprived, there's this constant culture among parents of the pregnant and of newborns where you're sharing notes. You're sort of asking advice. Maybe people just see that you're panicked and you're exhausted. But there's a culture that helps us talk about how you parent an infant, and we don't have the same culture about talking about how you parent a teen. And in lots of ways, this exercise is much less intuitive than figuring out how to take care of a baby that needs to be fed. right? And so I think that training wheels removal is a useful way to think about a lot of what you're trying to accomplish as you help kids transition from the dependent state of early childhood to the now independent state of exiting adolescence. So those are the 7 distinctions I'd like to draw. I'll try to keep them to 2 or 3 minutes apiece. First, this distinction between adolescence and perpetual adolescence. Adolescence is a pretty new concept in human history. More than 2,000 years ago, not many places had this idea that you could be transitioning physically, biologically, from childhood to adulthood and not have to become fully independent in every way. The old assumption, and today it's still the assumption in places that are war-torn or in abject poverty, but the old assumption was that if your body became adult, if you hit puberty, you were now free and obligated to go fend for yourself and to make ends meet. You now had to become financially independent, household structures, school leaving, emotionally, morally. In almost every way, people used to think that when you went from the dependent state of little bodies to the independent state of adult bodies, you're now an adult and you have to become independent. We don't really believe that. We have this category called adolescence, which is a pretty special gift. And I think the way to conceptualize it is think of it as an 18-month to 4-year period where you've hit puberty, and yet we still give you a greenhouse. You don't have to solve everything on your own. You don't have to become financially and emotionally and morally and in terms of school leaving and in terms of household structure formation. You don't have to go be a fully formed adult. That is great, so long as you understand adolescence as a means to an end. So long as you don't come to think of it as a destination. Peter Pan is a dystopian hell, right? Like, we forget this. Disney has tried to remake it as if there can be this destiny of permanent adolescence, as if this is a good thing. It is not a good thing to be in this state of now adult and yet not yet able to really take care of yourself and tend to yourself. Peter Pan is trapped in Neverland, right? He is bodily an adult and he's killing people. And he isn't able to reflect on that morally. He doesn't even have historical memory. He doesn't even want to remember the names of the people that he has killed, right? And so we've drifted to a place where it's really difficult to distinguish 10-year-olds from 15-year-olds, from 20-year-olds, from 25-year-olds. That's new in human history. That's different than celebrating the blessing of a greenhouse stage of adolescence. That's becoming sort of trapped in another place between now I'm not dependent in terms of bodily independence. I'm not in terms of bodily dependence on my mom or my dad or the security that they provide, and yet I'm not ready to fully transition out. We aren't thinking clearly enough about what those steps and those markers and those coming of age experiences are, the habits that we want our adolescents to form so that they can get to the independent state of fully contributing adults. Contributing. That flags for us this distinction between production and consumption. Most people, at most times in human history, would have felt in their belly the distinction between producing and consuming. Consuming is great, right? There are all sorts of wonderful things about consumption. Here, old Puritans would have debated the way you reflect on that word consumption, leisure versus recreation. People used to have some pretty angry fights about whether or not it was proper for Christians to use the term leisure because recreation was the preferred term, because it was recreating you to get back to the level where you would again produce, where you would live a life of gratitude and you would try to benefit your neighbor again. But that basic distinction between production and consumption is pretty deep in the belly of people who grew up around work. That's what's different, fundamentally. This book, The Vanishing American Adult, is not a beat-up on millennials book. It is not a blame-laying book at all. But if it were a blame-laying book, it would be about we parents and grandparents, much more than about the kids coming of age who are being raised in a time and a place that really is the richest time and place in human history, and a place where the vast majority of our kids grow up insulated from work. They don't grow up in a place where your household is sitting on top of some productive unit, some productive enterprise. And yet, that's really different than most people in history. Most people didn't have job choice in human history. They had becoming 8 or 10 or 12, right? And you got to be a certain age where you could add more value, either in the nomadic tribe or in the hunter-gatherer community, or in the agrarian community that you lived in, because people didn't choose jobs. They just did more of what mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles had always done. Job change is a pretty new concept, and it's pretty tightly connected with the industrialization. And so there I think it's useful to recognize most of human history was hunter-gatherers. And then about 10, 11,000 years ago, people in the Fertile Crescent started realizing that they would settle down, and they started to see the patterns of harvest. And they began to realize that they could plant, and the concepts of private property began to emerge. And so there was this pretty massive transition from nomads to settled farmers. I would argue that it's probably more disruptive than what we're going through right now, but we don't know a lot about it because we didn't have alphabets. Since then, though, I think there's a pretty good case to be made that we are living through the most disruptive moment in economic history. And as a historian, I'm pretty cautious about saying things like that, because usually a historian's job is to be a skunk at a garden party, right? Most people think that they live at a pretty unique moment in history. People always see lots and lots of discontinuity in their moment. And the historian's job is to tease out continuity and discontinuity. And usually there's a lot more continuity than discontinuity. And so usually the historian's job is to say, no, actually, this moment isn't all that unique. You just think it's unique because you're here and you're a narcissist. So usually that's the historian's job. But at this time, I actually think what we're going through is really extraordinary. So we had hunter-gatherers. We had the rise of agriculture 10,000 years ago. And then 150 years ago, we had the rise of the big tool economy. And that moment, that transition from agriculture to industrialization, is really the only analog that I think helpfully teases out what we're going through right now. Because at that moment, the concept of job change came into being. And so adolescence took on a new significance because something new happened that wasn't just you going from dependent to independent. It was you going from living in someone else's household to forming a new household that might have economic underpinnings that are different than the household you came from. And it's worth recognizing that that time, 1870 to 1900, 1920-ish, that 30 to 50-year window in American history, a lot of people believed that America couldn't endure. That what would happen as you had a whole bunch of people leave the farm and go to the cities was that you would have a disruption of known accountability, of neighborliness, of sort of Lockean sense of the commons. You would have this transition from a place where I was rooted to a place where I'm rootless. And so it's really important, even though almost all of us in this room would have big problems with a lot of the policy that led to things like prohibition. It's useful to understand, why did prohibition come about? It wasn't because people randomly were worried about a certain set of problems. It's because there really were a whole bunch of drunk 15-year-old Irish kids, right? Cities led to a kind of anonymity that scared people to death, that there would never be neighborliness again. And so that transition from agriculture to industrialization created a new kind of upheaval. I mean that in a literal sense. It created a rootlessness, an uprooting as people moved to cities. And it was a bipartisan belief that America might not endure. Democrats like Woodrow Wilson, Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, all thought you might be creating a new world where you can't possibly have the kind of local, decentralized, self-control, self-reliance, self-governance from the agrarian community, the Tocquevillian New England town green village. And in the cities, you would have all this perpetual anonymity. Well, it turned out what they were afraid of, perpetual job change and disruption, didn't come to pass. People really just had one big disruption. They went from the city, they went from the rural community or the little village into the city, or they migrated across the oceans and they got to the city. But when they got a new job, they tended to keep it for the rest of their life. And they tended to have a lot of dense social capital and human networks in the urban ethnic community that mirrored what they had known in the old village. And so a lot of the panic that America might not long endure was set aside. But it's useful for us as you go from hunter-gatherer to agrarianism, to industrialization, to this thing. What is this thing that we're arriving at? It's useful to recognize that when you went from stage 2 to stage 3, we didn't call this de-agriculturalization. We didn't call it post-agriculturalization. we ended up calling it, once we were comfortable, our ancestors were comfortable with it, we ended up calling it what it became. It became industrialization. It became urbanization. What do we call this thing right now? We don't have a name for it. The knowledge economy, the digital economy, the IT economy, the service economy, the mobile economy. Sociologists are just throwing in the towel now, and they call it the post-industrial economy, which is a way of saying we don't know what to call it. It's the after the last thing. And so the panic that people feel about this moment, we have analogs we can look back to in history when people were worried that America and self-control and self-governance and decentralization and local community and persuasion, not compulsion and not power, not government solving every problem, but lots of cultural norms. The thing they were worried about then might be the place that we're actually entering now. And what's different about our now than their now is you had 15 to 18-year-olds migrant across the landscape to the cities, but once they got there, they took a job that lasted until death or retirement. Or they graduated high school, or some small subset of them went to college, and they then got their job, and it lasted till death or retirement. We're never going to do that again. We are entering a world where the average duration at a job is shrinking rapidly, and it's going to forever. I was born in 1972. In the mid-1970s, average duration at a firm was 2.5 decades. Today, it's 3.8 years. And it's getting shorter and shorter, and it's going to forevermore. Work is one of the fundamental anchors of human identity. For people who are interested in the sociology of happiness, Arthur Brooks is one of the guys that translates a lot of this well for many of us. How many variables are there that drive whether or not you're happy besides your DNA? It turns out about half of whether you're happy or not is just genes, so it is sort of mom's fault. But how many variables are there that drive whether or not you're happy? You know, you think there might be 50 or 100 or 1,000. There are 4. There are only 4 things in the literature that really drive whether or not people are happy. Do you have a family? Do you have any friends? And I mean that in an Aristotelian sense. People who are happy, they feel pleasure when you're happy, or they feel pain when you're sad. They have an expansive sense of the self. They don't choose to love you, they just do. It's the way we feel towards our kids, right? When one of my kids hurt, I don't choose to ache with her, I just ache. She's mine, I love her. I hurt if she hurts. Do you have family? Do you have friends? Do you have a theological framework to make sense of death and suffering? And by far, the largest variable in whether or not people are happy is, do they think they have meaningful work? Not does my back hurt at the end of the day, not do I think I make enough money, not is there an annoying jackwagon who talks too loudly 3 cubicles away, but fundamentally, when I leave my house on Monday morning, do I think someone needs me? Does my work matter? If I think my work matters and I'm needed, you're going to be happy. And if you don't, you're not going to be happy. Happiness is not the be-all and end-all of life, but when you're thinking about civic peace and community, it matters quite a lot that we understand what drives people's happiness. And it turns out if you're disrupted from jobs, you're probably going to be disrupted in lots and lots of other fundamental ways of life. We're not here to talk about legislation and policy, but the #1 driver of growing uninsurance in America is job change. It is not socioeconomic status. It is not health status. It is that 4 to 6 month period every 3.8 years when people change jobs. That's when you get the breast cancer diagnosis. That's when you have the car accident. Now you become the pre-existing condition population for 5 and 10 years from now. We could go social ill by social ill, and so many of them are rooted in this idea that we don't know how to think about transitioning people at 40 and 45 and 50 and 55 when they get disrupted. Do we think it's an accident that opioids is now displacing car accidents as a killer in lots of communities across America? Of course, some of that is the potency of the specific drug. But lots and lots of it is what's happening in the disruption of lives of 40 and 45 and 50 and 55-year-olds. And we don't even know how to think about this moment of disrupted work in a middle-aged population. There has never been a society of lifelong learners before, and we have to create that if America is going to survive. And so we well recognize, we feel in our bellies, even if we don't know how to think about or talk about, we well recognize that this disruption of teenage experience is partly related to the fact that we don't live in communities of work, whereas people come of age, they're shepherded into the work of their community or to a small set of choices, and that when they get shepherded into that stable work, it's going to define their neighborhood, it's going to define their kith and kin network, and it's going to create a kind of stability of place. Hunter-gatherers were nomadic. Agrarians lived in villages. Industrialists, and by the way, we sort of mythologize lots of this. The high water mark of industrial employment in all of US history was 1956. It was only 31% of the public. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we make up, but it was enough primary breadwinners that it did create a rootedness in the community. What's happening now is almost everybody has a sense that that suburban to ex-urban placelessness is what they're worried about. They're worried about it because you don't know who your friends are, you don't know who your neighborhood is, and you don't know if your work is going to matter. And that produces this fundamental crisis of loneliness in our time. We don't have good categories for this. I'm a German Lutheran Stoic by upbringing. I'm not good at talking about my feelings in public. But when we talk about loneliness in this way, I'm talking about this Aristotelian sense of, are there people who hurt when I hurt? Are there people who take joy out of my pleasure? Am I known? The average American had about 3.2 friends in 1990. The average American has about 1.8 friends today, a halving of friends in 25 years. 40% of Americans have no meaningful confidants. 40% of American adults have no one that they talk to about the big things in life, about their hopes and their dreams and their worries. I serve in politics for a time. Again, I'm one of 5 people who've never been a politician before. This is not my dream calling on earth. I believe in sort of an Eisenhower sense of part-time politics as a calling for all Americans. But I find it really, really odd how many people project grand hopes and dreams onto politics. The 535 people I work with, we're not interesting enough for anybody to cast grand hopes and dreams upon. Right? So I find the tribalism of our politics really, really odd. And yet when you realize that 40% of people have no deep friendships, then it makes a lot more sense how we're filling in these gaps. Our coming of age experiences in institutions need to be fundamentally rethought, because if we're going to create a civilization of lifelong learners, that means we should tease out a little bit more, what is it like to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful, and to be curious, and to have a broad liberal arts education that produces empathy? And what does job training and retraining look like? Because we're going to have to create institutions for 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds to be retrained. That's probably not going to be 4 years of residential living built around college football schedules, as glorious as that might be. But we're probably not going to do that for 45-year-olds. And so we need to unbundle the concept of schooling really radically in our minds. We need a lot more diverse sense of what schools are. And again, this project is not about policy, but the one war cry I have in this book is down with grade 13. Because there is this new concept emerging all across the country to think about the experience of 19-year-olds as 13th grade. What's happening is more and more people are recognizing that we don't have clear work opportunities for people when they finish high school, and so probably more and more people are going to go to college. But instead of thinking intentionally about what the tool of college should accomplish for our kids, we're just using it as a warehouse to pass people on from what had become kind of the top end of the warehousing of secondary education. I am a proponent. I'm the son of a public school teacher. I'm a product of Nebraska Public Schools. My dad is a football coach and wrestling coach. My wife is a former public high school teacher and administrator. I believe in lots of the American tradition of public education. And yet, we should be able to historicize the rise of mass secondary schooling and ask some hard questions about it. Because I think mass secondary education has been on net a benefit, but it has not been an unmitigated benefit to take 14 and 16 and 18-year-olds and have them spend most of their waking hours indoors in a sedentary posture receiving wisdom that's handed down before they have a Socratic curiosity in their belly to demand that the doors of the library be thrown open and to demand that they would shake the fruit trees to learn and to figure out how to climb that mountain. And so the institutionalization of secondary schooling, I think we should regard as a net benefit, but we should be able to ask hard questions about it, and we should be able to distinguish why 8th and 9th grade are probably better than 11th and 12th grade. And I certainly don't want us to drift to a world of mass 13th grade where we transition our kids from secondary to tertiary education and we want them to still be primarily in a passive posture to the institution of the next level of schooling they're going toward. I don't want to grow 12th grade to 13th grade. I want to pluralize higher education and then see it crowd back down into 12th and 11th grade, asking hard questions of us. I'll stop here on education, but I want to say Salman Khan is one of the most interesting people in American education today. And I think you can argue, if you don't know Khan Academy, Google it when you go home, Khan. Sal Khan is a guy about my age who is arguably the most influential math teacher in the history of the world. And he's not a mathematician. He's a guy who was decent at teaching videos on a whiteboard in 9 and 12-minute increments to his niece in Cleveland. And he realized instead of sending her this big data-heavy file by email, he started uploading it onto YouTube. And all of a sudden, 300,000 kids, and then 1 million kids a day are learning algebra from Sal Khan. And then a whole bunch of people come to him, including the Gates Foundation, and say, hey, why don't you quit your job in private equity, and why don't you do this full time? You have a gift. Instead of just algebra, let's do geometry. And can we do physics? And we started climbing all these different neighboring disciplines in the sciences and then up and down the math scale. Sal Khan has demonstrated a bunch of interesting things about the way we teach math. Is he the panacea for all that ails American education? Of course not. But the digital moment that we're entering is going to create a whole bunch more Sal Khans. And we should have a big plural vision as we throw up a creative whiteboard about how we should blue sky. I feel like I'm mixing snowplows and snowflakes there, but I have whiteboards and blue skies. But ultimately, we need to really rethink how we conceive of schooling. And that gets us back to the place where I want to stop and turn it over to Jamie. In a republic, we believe that the people have the capacity to rule, and they have the duty to rule, and they have the right to rule. We believe in a conception of liberty where we don't think government is the author or source of our rights. We think we, the people, come together and we give the government limited powers, enumerated powers, to try to do certain things for the common good. But the dignity of people precedes government. The rights of people precede government. But if you're going to live that vision of community, we actually need people who've been formed with the habits and the virtue to be capable of self-governance and self-rule. And there's a whole bunch of data right now that would suggest we're not helping our 12-year-olds and our 14-year-olds and our 16-year-olds think about what transitioning to adulthood looks like and think about and actually develop the habits that are commensurate with self-rule. And all of that is because we don't have a place for a lot of our shared conversation about what it looks like to parent an adolescent. I think we have a hollowing out of local community at the same time that we're having a politicization of national conversation. There's a whole bunch of mediating space that gets lost in that, where people and parents, there's nothing more common than the experience of loving your kids and wanting to help them grow up. But we don't have a lot of communal context where we deliberate about what it looks like to raise our children well. And I wrote this book partly because when I got to Midland, as Sheree mentioned, when I became a college president, I was 37, and I was a turnaround guy. I was taking over a 130-year-old liberal arts college that was in danger of going bankrupt, a really special place, and I was a turnaround guy. And I lived in this town. We were raising our kids in Nebraska even as I commuted all over the country for my crisis management projects. Nobody thought I was being hired to lead this college because I had any sense of student culture or student life or student affairs. I was a 37-year-old. And yet, when I got to the college, the thing that I lost the most sleep about was looking at the 18-year-olds that would arrive at our college, and I didn't think of myself as that much older than they were. I'd gone away to college less than 2 decades earlier. But when I went to college, almost no one that I graduated high school with and almost no one that I arrived at college with hadn't worked before. Almost everyone had had some meaningful hard work experience where you suffer and you learn to persevere and you learn that you can endure. When I got to the college in the fall of 2009, the vast majority of our kids had never really done any work before. And this wasn't a socioeconomically rich school. It was just the nature of coming of age is more and more insulated from work experiences. And so that in the belly sense of the distinction between production and consumption wasn't something that our kids intuitively knew. They didn't feel it. Life was time spent in school. That was your work. That was your production. Progression through age or years or grades. And then there was time outside of school that was this broad range of differentiated consumption. And again, not always able to distinguish between needs and wants. When I think about raising a kid and a little kid, you're constantly aware of the things that you want to protect them from so that they can make their own decisions. You don't put those little plastic things in your outlets at your house to not electrocute a kid who's 2 or 3 years beyond putting a spitty, wet finger into a light socket, right? You are protecting them from things until you no longer need to protect them. And in a way, this metaphor of training wheels removal is imperfect because I'm a decidedly no training wheels guy. I've taught all 3 of my kids and a lot of neighboring kids to ride a bike, and we don't use training wheels. I wrap them up. This is the only time I bubble wrap a kid. We wrap them in snow gear. You put them in a ski suit, and you put a big hat on them, and I position myself behind the back wheel of their bike, and we go get on a hill. And I put the bike on a slightly declining hill, and I run behind the bike, straddling. At 45, this kills on your back, by the way. It's a good argument for having kids when you're 27. I run straddling the back wheel of the bike, and I just bat my kid shoulder to shoulder as we fall down the hill until all of a sudden, boom, it catches. And they get their balance, and they know how to ride a bike. You can teach a kid to ride a bike this way in well under 2 hours. But you sometimes get stitches. And it's not just the kid, it's you. But we need to celebrate scar tissue with our kids because scar tissue is the foundation of future character. And we don't want our kids to believe that they're not resilient enough to handle falling off a bike or to handle a hard debate when they get to college. They don't need a safe space when they get to college. They need actual argument. It needs to be in a community of care and concern, to be sure. But if you're going to college to be sure you're insulated from ever encountering any idea you didn't already know, I have no idea why your parents are paying tuition, because that's the point of education. And I think that the training wheels picture for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old is very similar to most ways that you're parenting a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old. The goal is not to have the kid behind you on a tandem bike or to riding next to you with all sorts of helps in these training wheels. The goal is that your kid can ride next to you and appreciate the good, the true, and the beautiful, and smell the flowers, and ride that bike next to you, and eventually sail off around the corner on their own, and find a mate, and figure out how they can help another kid learn to ride a bike. And right now, I don't think we have categories for coming of age, and I think a huge part of it is because this is artificial for us in ways that it has never been artificial for people before. Most people knew necessity as the mother of invention because households needed the benefit of childhood labor. In mid-18th century America, more than 30% of all economic value, most economic historians estimate, more than 30% of economic value was actually provided by the children. And so 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds, they were needed. And if happiness is fundamentally driven by work and by being needed and being able to live out a life of gratitude to serve someone else, we're not serving our kids very well if we take the accident of history that their work isn't really needed today when they're 14 and 15 and 16, and we don't figure out how to speed them to both the affections and the habits of being able to work and being able to be needed and being able to live a life of gratitude. Thanks for having me.
I just figured out you have to be a little bit of a Calvinist to follow Senator Ben Sasse, because you have to kind of like really love being humbled. It's like, God doesn't really want me to be happy anyway. Why don't you try to follow that? It's such an honor and a privilege to be part of this conversation. I appreciate it so much, and it's great to see new faces and some familiar faces. I'm here in the spirit of our mutual appreciation of hockey. My response is to offer an assist, less than a criticism. So I played defense, so I only know how to assist. I don't know how to score. What I want to do is just sort of tease out maybe a theme from the book and dive into it a little bit deeper as part of beginning our conversation. I absolutely share Senator Sasse's sense that something has shifted. debilitating mix of nostalgia and perpetual adolescence is something that I think hit home for me about 5 years ago when I saw a New York Times article on adult proms. And I immediately thought, this is the saddest thing I've ever seen. And what I couldn't get out of my mind was, do you remember Uncle Rico in Napoleon Dynamite? And the reason Uncle Rico would have absolutely signed up to go to the adult prom, because he was the guy suckered by a time machine so that he could go back and keep living his senior year in high school. I could have won state, right, is his sort of perpetual mantra. This is not a recipe for a happy life. But I want to, let's say, complicate the diagnosis just a little or tweak the prescription just a bit. As a philosopher, I am skeptical of appeals to willpower. And as an Augustinian, and maybe a Canadian, I'm always just a little bit hesitant about appeals to self-reliance. So I want to dive into some of those themes and think about this theme of habit, which is in the book. It's a huge part of the conversation. What I think we have to realize is we can't think our way to virtue. And we can't will our way to virtue either. It's a perplexing, frustrating thing. I wish we could think our way to virtue. If you could think your way to virtue, everyone with a PhD would be a saint. They're obviously not. So there's something else going on here. And I think that's because we don't, for the most part, think our way through the world. We are creatures of habit. We're animated by loves and longings and hungers that orient us often under the hood of our conscious awareness. And those loves and longings are habits, in fact. And when they're good habits, that's what we call virtues. So virtue in this sense is precisely what you don't have to think about, interestingly, right? Once you've acquired the virtue and it's become woven into your character, it becomes the disposition that characterizes who you are. So now you are this kind of person who moves through the world in this way because it's sort of become built in. But the habits that are inculcated in us reflect in many ways the social architecture that we are immersed in, right? Virtue, we have to remember, virtue is in many ways caught. And that's precisely why virtue is not the sort of thing you can brag about. It's not an accomplishment, in a sense. It's a gift. There's something deeply social about the gift of virtues that are inscribed in us. So that even our self-reliance, of course, as the senator suggested, is the sort of thing you learn from others. It's I think probably one of the great ironies is that you would learn to be grateful, to have been taught to be self-reliant. So what I'm calling social architecture here, Matthew Crawford describes as cultural jigs. Cultural jigs. Now, what he means by cultural jigs is this kind of like nested set of nudges and guides that are woven into an array of institutions and social patterns. It's a way of channeling your attention. So the metaphor comes from, say, carpentry or something, right? If you're building a fence and there's a number of spindles that are going to be in that fence, you're cutting all of them the same length. You don't measure every one. You create a jig on your saw and you just keep running the boards through so that you don't have to think about that. But in fact, the beauty of the jig is it actually frees up your attention because it channels your attention to the things that you do need to be thinking about and be careful about. So the carpenter with a jig jigs the repetitive things, but then frees himself up or herself up to think about very unique challenges. Now, I think in a way you could say what The Vanishing American Adult is describing is a world, a society where we keep removing the jigs that made for flourishing in society. The erosion of an ethic isn't just the fruit of bad choices, it's really because an ethos has changed. The water we swim in has changed. The defaults have shifted. The guardrails of a society that we used to take for granted have moved or have been removed altogether. So the answer here then is more than just rites of passage. It's going to have to be the cultivation of ongoing rituals that now channel our attention, train our hopes, direct our loves. So if I'm going to develop virtue and character, I actually depend upon this social architecture, this kind of the gift of the scaffolding around me that builds me so that eventually that can be taken away. Think of it this way. Jigs teach you to take the right things for granted, and that's a gift. Now, this might complicate the narrative just a little bit, but on the one hand, I think that means that if prior generations exhibited different patterns, a different work ethic, different modes of social responsibility, it's not necessarily the case that they get credit for making fantastic, heroic choices. Do you know what I mean? In fact, what it's saying is, like every other generation, they were shaped and primed by a social architecture that kind of defaulted them into these patterns. If there was, for example, a clearer line from adolescence to adulthood that went through employment and military service and marriage and raising children and buying a home, it's not so much because that was a matter of individual resolve, but more because the guardrails of society's social architecture channeled us into such patterns of life. Remember, virtue is caught. Now, on the other hand, if those channels, those jigs, those guardrails have changed, as Senator Sasse emphasizes both tonight and in the book, this is not a recipe for diagnosing some pernicious refusal of moral responsibility in a new generation. There's something much more complicated going on. And in fact, I've started to wonder if, in some sense, the challenge we're seeing today is not because we're asking less of young people, but in some sense or on some register, we are asking them to do so much more. Now, let me explain. You see, when you remove the cultural jigs, every action has to be a decision. Do you see what I mean? And so everything you do now has to be a conscious choice, a matter of individual resolve. And that's when mistakes start to happen, and that's when failures happen. When I worked in carpentry for a few years, and I will never forget the day we were trimming out this beautiful house with this gorgeous oak trim, and I was on the chop saw, and it was my job to cut this last piece of trim. And I cut it short. And so Bob and Hilton said, Jamie, you're going to have to do it again. And so I tried, and I do it again. And every time I'm measuring, I didn't have a jig. I measured again. I forgot the 1/4 inch for the saw blade. I blow it again. It's the last piece of oak trim we have. Jamie, you're driving all the way to Keynote. You're going to get another piece of wood. This is all coming out of your check, by the way, and you're going to get this right. Because what happened was, in a sense, because it was all on me and I hadn't been effectively trained, I keep blowing it. What I want us to appreciate is that as we are creatures of habit, and as creatures of habit, we simply don't have the capacity to always be consciously making good choices. I know that sounds slightly scandalous, but this is in a sense the lesson of David Brooks' The Social Animal, right? That you actually can't be on executive function all the time. Our attention is too quickly depleted, and we experience what psychologists describe as the cognitive fatigue of executive processes. And so now, think of that on a societal level. A society without cultural jigs is a world where we have to make up everything as we go. And that's exhausting, and it's unsustainable, and it doesn't tell the truth about the good. So, in other words, and here I'll don my Augustinian cap for just a moment, freedom is as much part of the problem as it is the solution. Senator Sasse makes exactly the right distinction. Freedom from is almost the only way we know to think about freedom today. And if that's the case, what happens is it gets absorbed. You give people freedom from means you think freedom is taking away every cultural jig. that would channel us into flourishing. And by the way, it's not just the behemoth of the state that will gobble that up. There's a lot of money to be made removing cultural jigs as well. I think Yuval Levin in The Fractured Republic puts this very well, that there's both a state and a market danger here that compromises us. So here's where, what should we do in response? Again, just assisting Senator Sasse's prescription. The response at some level has to be institutional, not just individual. And not even just familial, although I think this is a very, very powerful part of the book's argument. When I say institutional, let's not fall into the trap of thinking that I immediately mean political. In fact, here's my modest proposal that I want to lay on the table to close. If what we're talking about is creating societies where there are these cultural jigs that channel us into good lives and launch us to be the kinds of people we are made and called to be, what if we looked anew at the church as a key node in our social architecture? Think of, this is just one example of one of the mediating institutions that we could talk about. But what if you thought about the church now as an incubator of rightly ordered love for the common good? A place where God is shaping citizens of the city of God who are then sent into society for the sake of their neighbors. Now, granted, I think we would have to be very honest at the extent to which the church has failed to be this. And that, in fact, we, in ways that resonate, I think, a lot with Senator Sasse's book, the church has also fallen prey to distractions under the guise of relevance. And we have too often been party to destroying cultural jigs because we've been suckered by the cult of novelty. So I think there's a self-critique that has to happen here. But on the other hand, the church at its best, and by the way, this will not be the churches that get attention from media. In fact, the more I've been thinking about this, I think the perfect visual parable of your argument, and what I'm suggesting here, is a fantastic movie called Lars and the Real Girl. Has anybody seen Lars and the Real Girl? Ryan Gosling. How can you not love Ryan Gosling? It's this beautiful Midwest, Minnesota parable and picture of a life where, and what's interesting, Senator, is that in a sense you have these young people who are parenting without a net. They are learning to be adults without a net because of the generation before has kind of blown it for them. And yet, it's also a place where you see, and loneliness is a key theme here. What you see is this quiet, humble little Lutheran church in some small Minnesota town, which is actually teaching them all how to be human and actually how to be adults. The church isn't an event space in this picture, okay? And what I'm talking about is the kind of institution we need, what's formative and transformative about the quotidian realities of a healthy local congregation is precisely its ongoingness. That the Spirit meets us there in a constellation of practices that teach us to love justice and show mercy and walk humbly. Indeed, the disciplines, practices, and rituals of the historic body of Christ do exactly what Senator Sasse calls for in his book. In fact, when I was reading at the end of the one chapter where you suggest, here's sort of like 5 things that you should value, and it sets up that last part of the book. When, for example, he exhorts us to discover the body, my response was immediately, there's a liturgy for that. Baptisms and funerals and ministry to the sick are tangible ways that we practice being a multi-generational people who are called out of our own self-interest. And in fact, what's interesting in those liturgies is you make promises to babies, and you keep your promises to seniors. This is what's so beautifully pictured in Lars and the Real Girl. You learn to be a multi-generational people. Think of, again, the sort of quotidian ho-hum, almost boring ministries of mercy that engender their own unique work ethic. Pilgrimage and mission are a kind of purposeful travel that resists the consumerism of mere tourism. Scripture, the lectionary, Lectio Divina, are disciplines that teach us how to read, how to listen, how to be stretched, to attend to what matters. These are all the sorts of practices that Senator Sasse offers as the features of healthy adults who know how to be citizens. Now, I'm not suggesting that the church is some magical solution for our social ills. I'm only suggesting that if we're looking for institutional responses to this erosion of cultural jigs, the church is part of that web of social architecture that pulls us out of the interests of self and even, in important ways, pulls us beyond the tribes of our families, too, and throws us into a wider scope of concern that transcends both. The church is one of those sites of grace that enables us to be human and maybe even adults. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Ben. As you can tell, we could go on for quite some time. We're actually going to have to wrap up in just a few minutes, so we'll consider this next short question and answer session to be almost a little bit of a lightning round, and then we'll take audience questions. But for everyone out there, I highly commend both books, The Vanishing American Adult and You Are What You Love, and I think you'll find that those two books in combination also make for a fascinating dialogue and a much fuller one that we'll actually be able to get to tonight. But in reading both books, one of the things I was really struck by was an overlap of recommendations that were perhaps a bit obscure. Both of you highly recommended an expansion of peer networks to intergenerational ones. And both of you talked quite extensively about the family dinner table, and not only the importance of eating together, but the importance of singing together. What is so important about eating, singing, and reciting poetry together?
Please. I'll just say quick. Yeah, I mean, it goes to something that the senator talks about in his book, and you mentioned actually, Cherie, in the opening. Aristotle said one of the most important ways that you learn the virtues is actually by imitating exemplars. And so what happens wherever we can create these spaces for intergenerational being together, what's happening is young people are getting to see their parents, other adults, and then I think very importantly seniors, who are the saints of any local space. They're sort of showing them what their future could be, but they're modeling something powerfully. And you don't have to say a word, and it's absorbed. Sadly, Vice is absorbed the exact same, by the same dynamic. But I found, I think the church's, for example, choice over the last 30 years to stratify itself generationally and sort of segment ourselves out is something the senator talks about as well. I think it has detrimental effects for the ongoingness of faith in that respect. The dinner table is partly because Deanna's a fantastic cook, but also it's that sort of, I think it's a little microcosm of covenant faithfulness, right? It's just saying something. It's like as a parent, you're trying to embody for your kids, God shows up every day and is faithful in that respect.
What he said. That's well done. I know we're going to go fast, so I'll say only an echo of the table is a picture of the eschatological banquet hall for a reason. Right? This feast is the thing that we have this yearning for deep in our belly, and ultimately, we're not sufficient to be the host. And so you're invited as a gift to this thing, and it is always an intergenerational thing that even if you're eating with peers, you still have inherited memory of feasts that you've been at in the past, and your first memories of feasting are you as a kid. And there are parents and grandparents at that table feasting. And I think if you brought people from 300 years or 3,000 years ago to our moment and you dropped them out of their time machine into our place, I think unquestionably the first thing they would think about our time and place as a contrast to theirs is just the material abundance, the sort of all the produced stuff, the natural versus the built. We have more built stuff than anyone has ever had in human history. But 30 days after being among us, I think they would get over that. That wouldn't be the thing that continues to ring in their ears. What would ring in their ears is that we live the most generationally segregated lives anyone has ever lived. It is weird that our 17-year-olds think that 17-year-olds are the whole world. It's not true. And as the father of 13 and 15-year-old girls, when another 13 or 15-year-old girl slights you, it hurts. But it hurts a lot less if you know some 60 and 75-year-olds who've been through real hardship in life. It provides perspective.
One thing both of you talk about quite extensively in your books, although not tonight, is the importance of reading. The story one finds oneself in, the capacity for imagination. I think the last part of your book, you actually challenge your readers to build their own bookshelves. But as both of you probably know, reading is in decline. Reading is declined, particularly among people who read less to begin with. Among boys, reading of novels and great stories in particular are in decline. What are the implications for our ability to be a nation of adults if reading continues to go downhill?
I think Gutenberg is the true father of America. The sine qua non of America is the printing press. If you don't have mass literacy, you don't get to a marketplace of ideas, you don't get to clarity about cultural pluralism, the fact that people don't agree about heaven and hell and really big things, and you don't ultimately get to a public square that's defined by the freedom from violence, so you can have freedom to engage in these big discussions that are too big to ever think that the soul can be compelled. The soul has to be persuaded. The soul has to fall in love. And ultimately, reading it fosters a certain kind of appetite. It fosters a certain kind of deliberation before you make your choice. And in a world where now our American sort of broad polling survey data on this, not polling data, survey data, the average American now reads only 19 minutes a day, and it skews by age. The older you are, you're reading a good bit more than 19 minutes, and our kids are reading a good bit less than 19 minutes. And I don't have full confidence that America can go forward as an image soundbite culture. And so I think this is a critically important problem. And the digital tools, neither of us really ended up talking at all about the digital moment of our kids. And I am a proponent of lots of what the mobile digital IT economy can produce in terms of total global output. But I think it also creates new kinds of affections and habits that are really, really dangerous, and we need to deliberate about them. The dinner table is a different place if you have your smartphone at the table, because you're sending a signal to your spouse or to your kids or to your parents. You're a little bit interesting, but I got to be on standby for the thing that's probably more interesting than you. And I think we have to, even though most of us in this room are probably not Luddites, I want to embrace a lot of the digital economy. It's going to require a new kind of habit formation to guard against the digital addictions of our time.
And I would just add, I think the kind of reading, and you talk about this as well, matters that we encourage, because if we're not just thinking our way through the world, if we're not just brains on a stick, if we're animated by our loves and our longings, what that also means is actually our imaginations govern our being in the world much more than we realize. And so if you're working from some shriveled imagination, it actually really shrinks your capacity to know how to respond creatively and well in challenges. And so I think a kind of reading that keeps taking us into worlds of fiction and poetry and literature and the imagination shaping capacity of that has payoff well beyond what you intake for, say, learning or knowledge. You know?
Jamie, we'll start with you on this. Since you wrote the book, You Are What You Love. If we are what we love, and what we are is an increasingly adolescent nation, in what ways have our loves become disordered?
Well, and I don't want to pick on adolescence, right? So I would say, it's interesting. St. Augustine would say, there are two cities. You're a citizen of one or the other city, and what characterizes what he calls the earthly city, the city of man, is actually self-love. Like at the heart of that, that can find many, many different expressions. So I think probably what I worry about is the perpetual adolescence. There's reasons why adolescence often is characterized by both paralyzing self-consciousness and a deep, deep kind of self-interest that is often fanned and flurried by all kinds of social factors. If you now are 45 and you inhabit the world the same way, I think it becomes very, very hard for you to just think about your neighbor. Like it becomes harder for you to get pulled out of your own self-interest. So maybe, I don't know, does that fit? The disordered love would be that it keeps curling back on me, perhaps.
I want to underscore the point that you made, Jamie, as well, when you were at the podium about ultimately the way that you cultivate, it sounds too trite, but the habit of gratitude, but recognizing that you ultimately don't accomplish these things. You receive these gifts. And if you're Tantalus, if you're always thinking that I'm almost to the place where I can be happy and contented, you're misunderstanding the spiritual and the material, because ultimately contentment is a condition of the soul. It's not a product of our material circumstance. And when you're contented, you can go through, we could parse all of Ecclesiastes here in a hurry. There are a whole bunch of seasons that can be satisfying if you know how to embrace the gifts of what you've been given in that moment, even though it's often not the thing you wanted, as opposed to if we believe we're going to actually bring it about, and we believe not just that I am the center of the world in terms of my own loves and my affections, but my self-sufficiency, it's a myth.
Yeah.
Before we turn to audience questions, one of the things I wanted to pick up on was, although your book is primarily about a loss of independence, autonomy, agency, self-sufficiency among young people, most of what you talked about was actually a decline of interdependence, of connectedness, of relationality, of the mutual bonds and obligations. What do you see as the link between these two?
Well, I think that we're obviously social animals. We're made to live in community, and we have to cultivate empathy. If you're going to ultimately not have narcissistic adults, you have to get through a phase of life where the frontal lobe wasn't fully formed, right? When 13-year-old boys and 15-year-old boys feel that adrenaline, I'm from Nebraska, so we can drive at 14. So let's reposition this. 16-year-old boys and 17-year-old, I don't know what the DC and Virginia laws are. You drive at 16, 17, I guess. In Nebraska, you can drive at 14. When our boys drive too fast, that's partly biological, right? They haven't yet learned to internalize that self-control and that self-restraint. We have to teach our kids. Your whole jig picture all through your talk was just a great gift, and I want to bug you more after this to learn from it. But you're ultimately building habits and building not just familial institutions, but broader institutions. That's some of what I mean by the pluralization of the schooling that we should do. But we're trying to create empathy in our kids so they get out of that narcissistic ghetto of believing that they're the center of the world and they can satisfy themselves. We're made, again to stick in Ecclesiastes, to pour ourselves out. We're made to ultimately share the blessings and the gifts that we have in service. We're meant to live a life of gratitude to God by giving back in our community. And the only reason you're ever going to ultimately be satisfied is because you're serving someone else. We're not made to be king.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I think solidarity is the great social project right now. That in some sense, it struck me, for Awaiting the King that's coming out in the fall, I've spent a lot of time in Augustine's City of God again, and it just struck me how much he's talking about the way that you need to knit a sense of solidarity amongst a people to be able to pull this off. And I think there are obviously a lot of forces that run against that. Our social nature can find expression either as competition or as solidarity, and I think we need more imagination about the institutions that can keep fostering that. And it's just the beginning of that conversation, it seems to me.
We're going to turn now to the most dynamic part of our evening conversation, which is audience questions and answers. Those of you who have been to a Trinity Forum conversation before know that we have 3 simple rules for all questions at evening conversations, which are simply all questions should be brief, and particularly so tonight since we're running a little bit over. All questions should be civil, and all questions should be in the form of a question. For tonight, we're actually going to add one additional stipulation, which is we ask that all questions be on topic. So if you have a question about the prospects for the healthcare bill, now is not the time. And as a moderator, I will cut you off. And in fact, I will stand up here so I can see people a little bit better. We have both Christian and Drew with microphones. Wait till you're called on. Questions from the audience. Right here in the middle.
Senator Sasse, so as I read your book, I got the impression that, very excellent book, that rest exists for work. And I wondered if theologically it might be important to say the opposite. That is, that work exists for rest, or that the end of work is Sabbath and shalom. And I'd love to hear both of you respond to that.
I'll go brief because I want to hear Jamie talk about the Lord's Day and the Sabbath. He's an applied Reformed theologian, and I think we don't know how to do rest, right? True. Deep in our soul is a false god that says, if I just work a little harder and I work a little more, I can fix all this. It's telling that he's gone to Augustine 4 times so far, and that my third kid is named Augustine.
Yes, it's great.
It's a bit theologically heavy for a 6-year-old, so we call him Breck, but his name is actually Augustine. I mean, surely the 6 days lead to the 7th, and the first day leads to the 6th, and we have all sorts of places in the tradition where people refer to the 8th day as a way of not letting this story end, right? So I don't think you can either say one or the other without getting on to the next, but surely it's the case that ultimately, as a theological foundational matter, my work is not living for the weekend. It's not to get through all this work so I can get to rest. It's that the rest and the blessings and the gifts are the foundation of me being able to go live as gratitude. So I don't want to limit it to one or the other, but if I've got to pick, the first day precedes the work days.
And I would just add, we don't ever want to think about rest as stasis or not doing, right? So that if you picture that shalom, can I just say how heartening it is to hear a senator use the word eschatological? I have, my hope in humanity is restored.
You use the term Cutodian. So I don't know if that's heartening or not, but I think you must have won a bet when you did that.
No. So just this picture, right? Even if you picture eternal rest, I think there's a lot of activity there, but it's recreation, right? It's a way of, so I think it's not stasis.
Another question, right here.
So Senator Sasse, I'm about halfway through your book, and I'm really enjoying a lot of your advice. But I feel like it's mostly tended towards parents who are starting the process of adolescence. What do you do when you have a 16 or 17-year-old who, best case scenario, you force them to get a job 2 days a week, you force them to play sports, and on the best day, they're taking a nap and looking at Snapchat the rest of the time? How do you redirect a kid that late in their experience of adolescence?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I don't know. But I could tell you the parenting discipline I got to do on the drive over to my 15-year-old with what she did to her 13-year-old today, and it led to her mowing a whole bunch of our land that doesn't usually need to be mowed. So the verb force is appropriate at this moment. The fastest growing subgenre of self-help literature is apparently this failure to launch literature. There's a whole bunch of people needing to buy books, and therefore there are a whole bunch of people writing books. How to parent your 28-year-old, how to get your 32-year-old to leave the house, right? The most common address for college graduates in America now is moving back home. And I've had some reviewers hit me a little bit on that and say, well, if you believe in solidarity and community and everything, what's terrible about an intergenerational household structure? Nothing. It's great if you chose it, right? It's a different thing happening when our 24-year-olds, after 6 years in college, the vast majority of colleges and universities now measure their graduation rate on a 6-year denominator, not a 4-year denominator. That's accidental. And so we've got a big problem that it is hard to distinguish 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds. So I don't know the answer to it, but I would say this, and thanks for plowing through the book. The first third is the sort of stage setting. How do we problematize this together? The last 2/3 is the part I like, which is these 5 habits that we should be seeking. But the goal of all 5 of these, have intergenerational relationships, intentionally build a work ethic or help your kids build a work ethic, experience limited stoicism, limit your consumption sometimes, understand why it's good not to eat all the cotton candy that you could, learn to read and travel, not grand European tour for rich people, but go to a different neighborhood 10 miles from where you are and learn people who organize their social community and their work lives and their households differently. All 5 of those things are ultimately about getting outside yourself. That's why you want to know other generations. That's why you want to learn to work even when you don't feel like persevering. That's why you don't want to continue consuming even when you might have the means to eat more cotton candy. It's why you want to travel. It's why you want to learn to read. Cherie's point about the decline in reading of fiction. Our kids are desperate for story. The problem is most of them are being satisfied with really crappy stories. C.S. Lewis's old line about the kid who declines the vacation to the sea because he's satisfied making mud pies in the streets. Right? There's a whole bunch going on there that's about expanding their horizons and pulling them outside of themselves. And I don't know how to do it. And this book is not pretending that it's got all the answers. I want to help facilitate a conversation of lots of neighbors and family and grandparents and local community that want to together wrestle with these questions of how we pull our kids outside themselves.
Other questions? We'll go right there.
Senator, I can't resist asking this question, but how many of your 99 colleagues are perpetual adolescents? And is our commander-in-chief one of them, or has he not reached that stage?
So I'll mostly duck. Let me just sort of get it right out there. The book is 100% not about politics. The president is never mentioned in the book, and it's overwhelmingly not about policy, except some of these questions about institutionalized schooling and its perpetuation beyond age 18. But I do think our politics have lots and lots of problems right now, and we keep trying to think that we might be able to fix our politics with politics. And most of what's wrong in our politics is well downstream from these cultural problems of us not having a shared understanding of what makes people happy, what a life well lived looks like, and what the purposes of government in our republic are. We really do inherit this blessed tradition of limited government. Our founders divided power vertically and horizontally. They tried to keep 9th and 10th Amendment are about the vast majority of powers that exist are supposed to be with states and localities, and of those powers that are federal, we distinguish among legislative, executive, and judicial functions. All of those things are done to guard against the consolidation of power because we in the American creed, don't think you can solve most important things by politics and by power. And right now I think we're increasingly tribal because a lot of our communities are hollow. Our neighborhoods are hollowing out. We don't know what social networks look like in exurbia. We knew that when you went from Tocquevillian villages to industrialization, urbanization, that our folks who panicked were wrong. You ended up recreating social capital in urban ethnic neighborhoods. We don't know what that new community formation and what neighborliness and what the disciplines of self-control and self-discipline and what the new kinds of institutions look like in the mobility of exurbia anymore. And so our politics are frantic right now as we try to figure out how to be against somebody else to make sense of the hollowness of our own souls.
For our last question, we'll go over on this side of the room, right back there. True? Yes.
I just wanted to say that I was a little bit troubled about what you had said with respect to human agency. It seems to me that the thesis that was advanced was that people need to accept what Obama had said, that you didn't make this. That is to say that people need to accept that they are the products of a moral ecology. And I wonder if that is a message which is inapposite for our age. What we need is people to believe that they can make this, that there's a belief in human agency, rather than, as you articulated, Jamie, especially, a belief that we are dependent upon our circumstances. Just wonder if you could reflect on that a bit.
Yeah, I want to talk about compatibilism, but this is not the place. What I guess what I'm thinking of is, I think our agency is always gifted. I think agency is a gift. So it's not a question of whether or not you are dependent, it is how you are dependent and launched because you are dependent. Again, I'm Canadian, so if any of this sounds communist or something, I didn't mean to be encouraging a sense that, oh, everybody should just be handing me everything. It's rather much more, I think it's built into the very structure of creaturehood that we are gift receivers who are then called to deploy the gifts that are given to us, and that's what we're responsible for. So even our responsible agency looks like really healthy dependence. And what I would hope is that it would actually break out of a certain dichotomy that we tend to have, which then does also tend to track with a political or ideological dichotomy that I don't feel very invested in. That's inadequate, but perhaps addresses it.
Let me try to put a bow around it too, because I'm the third or fourth most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record, but I have absolutely no anxiety about anything that Jamie said, because he jokingly called it Canadian communism, but let's just call it Tocquevillian communalism, because I think what we're really talking about, what we're really talking about here is not compulsory structures, but the fact that we are social beings and we're meant to live institutionally. And so as a close, maybe, it's worth remembering when Tocqueville tried to explain America to Europeans the way that he did it, right? He came here, we won the revolution, in the early 1780s, and you have the constitutional moment in Philly in 1787. But Europeans don't really think of America as truly independent until after the War of 1812. I won't be the boring historical nerd to explain why we had this extended time play soccer match for another 25 years. But fundamentally, Europeans see America as independent by the 18 teens, and they recognize that we're religious zealots and there are a whole bunch of cultural pluralists. And that's weird, that you could have all these people that believe things this differently and yet came together and built a common community. They could kind of make sense of that, though. What they couldn't make sense of is the economic dynamism that emerged in the next 2 decades. When you had the canal revolution and the railroad revolution and the proto-putting out revolution, which is like the setup to industrialized factory structures, you have all of this economic dynamism in America by the 1830s, and Europeans really can't make any sense of why that would be. And so I think the best way to think of Tocqueville is as a travel reporter. Right? If you own Democracy in America, it's 1,500 pages. It is a great, great thing to read, but that's not the way to read it. It's too daunting. Rip the spine off it and leave it in 5- and 7-page chunks all over your house. It's terribly redundant. View it as travel articles. That's what he really wrote. And so the problem he was trying to solve was, why does America have this dynamic economy? He obviously came to learn about prisons and a whole bunch of stuff at the beginning as well. But he was trying to understand why America has a dynamic economy. And when he came here, he thought, well, they have an incredibly dynamic economy. They must have the best bureaucrats. And so if I want to understand the meaning of America, I got to go to Washington, D.C. And he came here, and he wrote back, and he said, this is weird. It's a swamp with a whole bunch of people who don't work very hard. So my joke is not a lot has changed. And yet he had to make sense of this. And so he traveled to 17 of the 25 states at this point. And he went to state capitals all over America. And all of a sudden he wrote back to Europe and he said, I have figured out the meaning of America. It's the Rotary Club. We had this conception, we Europeans had this conception of isolated individualism or government-driven community. Either people live like the Unabomber off in the woods alone in Montana, or they must have bureaucrats that are planning all of their life by governmental compulsory powers. This is not the right way to think about the continuum. Americans are deeply communal people. They're deeply institutional people. They're deeply social people. They just believe in love. They believe in persuasion. They believe in voluntarism. The Rotary is the picture of America. You persuade people to marry you or to buy your product or to join your venture philanthropy project. And the Rotary is that picture of voluntarist community. And I think that's what Jamie's talking about. And I think we need to figure out how to rebuild the new Rotary clubs of 2025. Because today, the Rotary Club still exists in small towns and in certain urban ethnic neighborhoods. But the Rotary Club is dying in Appalachia. And the Rotary Club is not being born in Exurbia. And there's a whole bunch of hopelessness in America as we hollow out this local community and people hear national answers that are just political. That's the old false choice. We can do better than that. We particularly need to think about how our adolescents come of age in an institutional way.
And on that note of love and Rotary clubs, Ben, Jamie, thank you. There are obviously a lot more questions in this audience, so please avail yourself. You Are What You Love by Jamie Smith, as well as Ben's book, The Vanishing American Adult, which will be on sale tonight for $28. Ben will also be available to sign the book. The book will be just outside the front doors, along with an array of Trinity Forum readings and curricula for you to avail yourself of. Signings will be in the room next door. In addition to recommending both Jamie's and Ben's book, we would also highly recommend that you take advantage of the opportunity to join the Trinity Forum Society. The brochures should be on each of your chairs. We would love to warmly welcome you into the Trinity Forum Society, which makes possible events and programs such as this. We are a small nonprofit. We are dedicated joyfully to the task of trying to provide a space for leaders to grapple thoughtfully with what matters most, and in a way that is hospitable, warm, intellectually rigorous, that is countercultural both in the means as well as the ends. We would love to have you join us in this effort and become part of that society. As a special incentive for tonight, the first 10 people who join the Trinity Forum Society will get a signed copy of Ben's book without having to stand in the line. The line will be long. Avail yourself of this opportunity. My able colleagues would be eager to help you out, and if you could just raise your hand, stand up, my able colleagues, and let people know where you are, that would be terrific. In addition, there are plenty of benefits to being members of the Trinity Forum Society. Not only do you get invitations to events such as this, you also get our daily What We're Reading list of curated reading recommendations and our quarterly readings. For those of you who have read The Vanishing American Adult, you know that at the end, Ben makes a recommendation on the best readings that he believes should be involved with every person's bookshelf, as well as some other suggestions to debate. I can tell you right now that many of those same readings and books are also available as Trinity Forum readings, whether it's Nelson Mandela, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Alexis de Tocqueville, Augustine, Chesterton, Adam Smith, and others. They're all out on the table. And not only that, they come with a handy little introduction explaining context, as well as discussion questions in the back, such that they are simply a book club in a bag. And so we would encourage you to make use of those. In addition, if you'd like to share this event with others, we will have video of it up in just a couple of days. We'll also have photos on Facebook to share with your friends and recommend that you do that. Our next evening conversation will be in this very room in less than 2 weeks. On June 26th, we'll be delighted to welcome Dr. Praveen Sathupathy. It's quite the name to pronounce, but he will be talking about genes, the self, and the soul as part of our Science and Faith initiative. So hope that we will be able to welcome you back in less than 2 weeks to this very room. Finally, it is always appropriate to end with thanks. And every time we have an event like this, there are plenty of people to whom we owe those thanks. I'd like to start just by thanking Byron Smith and the Creating Culture Fund for his generosity in making tonight possible, as well as our volunteers who helped us out tonight. We have various intern emeriti, Nancy Ritter, Drew Masterson, and Noel Michael, along with volunteers Andrew Whitworth, Caleb Bauer, and Hannah Wolf, photographer Clay Blackmore, and also my extraordinary colleagues, Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White, and our current interns, Joanna Towles, Christian Barnard, and Allie O'Brien. Thank you again, Senator Sasse and Jamie Smith. Thank you to each of you for coming, and good night.